Welsh poetry and its tradition is quite different from English for many reasons. The most pronounced of those reasons is that it's a continuation. There's a steady strand of a bardic tradition all the way from when the language was forming to the present day, pretty much unbroken, and there's developments all the way through that which are continuous. So you have to look at it from the beginning in order to fully understand it. One thing I'm not going to be talking about today are manuscripts. The first Welsh poetry doesn't actually even come from Wales. Welsh was spoken across North England and the south of Scotland. Present-day Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Carlisle in England, there were Welsh kingdoms centered around these areas, such as a Gododdin, a Strathclyde, Rheged, Elfed, and there were a few other minor ones as well. Collectively, this region was called Yr Hen Ogledd, or the Old North. It's a way of remembering from a Welsh perspective that this used to belong to us. It's part of our heritage. It's our tradition. Our poetry comes from here. It's our Old North, Yr Hen Ogledd. As the Welsh language was forming out of Brythonic, it made some radical changes which made it into a new language. Long story short, it changed to become much more like Latin in some ways, and that made it a very remarkably different language from what was spoken before. And since these people would have not been able to understand the prior Brythonic language, this is really when we have what we can say as British poetry really begins in this period. And it would have been quite radical at the time. We have knowledge of several poets, Cian, Talhaerynawen, Blwchford, but only Aneurin and Taliesin's work has passed down to us, and this was in the 6th century, so this is a long time ago, long before anything was written in English or French or German, so it's quite remarkable that this has survived. Aneurin's work is the earliest which has passed down to us. His chief work is a Gododdin, which named after the kingdom Gododdin based around Edinburgh, and it's basically a long series of heroic eulogies. It's heroic poetry, people going into battle, a collection of 300 soldiers marching south across North England, and they fight a vastly superior force and all die heroically, and the bard escapes back to recite their eulogy in heroic epic and deeds, and it's very violent as you would expect. But one thing we find which is similar to Welsh poetry across the ages, there's a lot of alliteration, matching consonants, words which internal rhyming which develop much more sophisticated later on. And this is used as a repetition in theme. The other poet of this 6th century class of poetry is Taliesin, and he's a bit more of a mythical figure, but his poetry that we know comes from him is mostly built around the kings of Rheged, Irin Rheged, who built a small empire, a collection of kingdoms under him, kind of a high king. And his was praising his lord, giving eulogies to great warriors and recording a few battles which we have multiple sources for, so we do know that he did exist. He also praised the king of Elfed, Glwchawg, and kings down in Wales, present-day Wales, in Powys. So he traveled quite a bit, and he may have left Yr Hen Ogledd, the Old North, because of violence, or maybe he just wanted a better career. Poets during this time were a professional class, so he may have been quite successful, an international poet of the 6th century. From the 7th century to the 11th century, things are a bit darker and hazier. We have scattered fragments of poetry, we have nature poetry, and we call this Canir Boch, the song of the gap because we have lots of gaps in our knowledge. But we do have fine works, we just don't know who those authors are. No one left their names under their poems as you would expect bards to do today. Their names didn't really matter, it wasn't part of the poem, so they didn't record it. But we do have works like Artemis Prydain, which is a satire poem aimed at a Welsh king who didn't march into battle against the English, and this poem is basically calling for all the peoples of Britain and Ireland to gather together and push the English out, because they are the oppressors of the age and they're not very happy about these English coming in onto our island. You also get more peaceful poems. Edinburgh Dinbych, which is in the southern kingdom, and this is praising the beauty of the court, the fortress above the sea. And it's you can go to Dinbych Episco today. It's a very beautiful area. You can see why, even though it was year 895. We have 96 triads or trioedd in Welsh, and these are just rhyming threes or simple phrases of her heroes and objects and deeds, and it's used as we think was used by bards to learn their craft, to remember it. Not all of these come directly from this time period, but they do have their roots in this time period, and what we think it was a way of people building up a repertoire of poetic knowledge. And it has a lot of names of legends and fables which have not survived. Whilst we don't have the names of these poets in the period, we do have names of poets. So here are a few of those. And in this period, Taliesin creeps up. A lot of people were attributing poems to him as this kind of mythical figure, and including him in bits of prose as we have in the Mabinogion, as this heroic figure around which other legends of poets coalesced and gravitated to. So Taliesin is still growing in this period. We also have mentions of Myrddin or Merlin, and we have the first mentions of King Arthur. And it's important that we have this because King Arthur was not an English story. King Arthur was fighting the English. We have England on a Beddau, which is poems about where heroes are buried, and on an England form. See my other video about the Welsh England, and you can get more information about that. We have nature poetry, we have riddles, we have Rymmerson, which is people talking and competing in verse with each other within a poem. So we do have a lot from this period, but we don't know who the authors are. Again, we have a saga, well, a couple sagas, Canu Heledd and Canu Llywelyn, and these are to do with the borderlands of Powys, fighting against the expansion of the English to the east, and bringing down some of the remnants of the Hen Ogledd in the north, some eulogies again to Arian and the dynasty of Rheged. And these are quite remarkable. We do have quite a lot from the time period, but it's not concise. There's no overarching theme, except maybe perhaps praise to the Lord of the kingdom. Now from the 11th century going into the 13th century, we have a lot more poetry that has survived. The Welsh kingdoms are beginning to coalesce their power around royal courts. The poet of the Welsh princes, or Beirdd y Tywysogion, was from the 11th century to the 13th centuries, and this in many ways was a high point, even sometimes a golden age of Welsh poetry. You had poets who sang in more than one royal court. You had courts in Powys, Gwynedd, Deheubarth, Gwent, and they exchanged and interwove ideas and motifs in their poetry between these various kingdoms. We have quite a few poets who have their work has been passed down to us and survived. Here are a few of those. Candelo is by far the most prolific. The topic of these poets' poetry is concentrated around the power of the royal court. It develops on from the early poetry. It does contain that praise of the Lord ruling the nation and praising them when they die, but it's also an extension of their power in architectural forms. Descriptions of castles or towers come into play. They compare their lords to columns and towers. There's more metaphors involving architecture coming in. There's influence from French, which is quite remarkable. And there's elements of praising nature in a new individualistic way, which wasn't seen quite so pronounced early on. And in this time period, the poems get longer, they're more innate, there's much more wordplay, there's a lot of alliteration, there's experimentation with form, there's new ways of composing words, and it's a time of frantic growth in the craft of Welsh poetry. There's a patriotic revival in the late 12th century when the Welsh retake over large portions of their country from the English and push them out in a lot of areas. And what they do then is they take new words from French and adopt them into Welsh as symbols of power, and they interweave elements from the mythology of the Mabinogi into their poetry, and it's really a time of great growth and mild experimentation within the craft of being a tradition. During this period, we have the first Eisteddfod, which is a competition of poets and a celebration of Welsh culture, is held in Aberteifi, and it's important because this will come back into Welsh poetry, recycled in later on. It's a concept that is born in this period, and it's really important to understand that it has its roots in the Welsh princes and kings. In the late 13th century, the last Welsh kingdom is wiped out by the English as they come in and conquer it by 1284. The power of the Welsh kings or princes is being transposed into a gentry class of regional lords and localized rulers in these areas. But by the beginning of the 1300s, we have poetry resurfacing back into regional power centers, not around regional courts. So the poetry isn't a proclamation of state power, but it is a proclamation of social status, that you can hire a poet to sing for you personally and to praise your family and your lineage's exploits. And around this time, English methods of English poetry are beginning to influence Welsh poetry, and so Welsh poets have to come up with a way to adapt, otherwise their native traditions are going to be whittled away. And what happens is we have the development of Cynghannedd. Out of this alliteration that we saw earlier and the internal rhymings that have been growing throughout the period of Welsh history, a poet named David ap Gwilym is he is the most famous, the most prolific. He was perchance the greatest poet of all of Europe in the 14th century. He has vastly more poetry which has survived than any other poet writing at the time in England, Scotland, or Ireland. He is revolutionary in his time. He takes this new form of the cowydd and implements it with Cynghannedd and creates a vastly new way to carry on with Welsh poetry, even though the poets don't have kings and princes to uphold their status anymore. A lot of poets coalesce around him, and he's quite a rock star in a way because his style of poetry is imitated for the next several centuries. And this poetry of the gentry, or Berde Gelwer, is carried on for the next 3 centuries. It's quite conservative in that way. Welsh poetry becomes quite rigid and it doesn't grow much in that regard compared to the poetry of the princes, which was in that way more experimental and free and ornate. But one way in which this new poetry does excel beyond the Welsh princes is that it's more individualistic. You can implement your own personal style. And one thing that David ap Gwilym leaves is a sense of comedy. People, taking the mick, they joke, they're using poetry to laugh at people, to have a good time, rather than being all austere and serious about praising of their king. And he implements a lot of, again, continuing from the poets of the princes, influence of French, but this time the French is caniserch, or love poetry, and he combines that love poetry with comedy in a very radical and new way. And this is carried on. People of that time, they are influenced directly by David ap Gwilym in this sense, and here's quite a few of the poets that are in this 3 century long period, some of the most important. We have over 150 poets in this time frame, but towards the end it does begin to break down because a lot of the gentry, they want to move on in the world, they want to uphold their status, but the legal professions require English. There's a lot of the English church being influencing upon Wales. If you want to move on in the world in education, you're going to need to go to Oxford or Cambridge, which you need English in the time period to get a decent education. And so people are leaving behind the Welsh culture, which in turn affects the poets, who are those that they would be patroning. And you get the abolishment of the monasteries in the 16th century and the coming really of a Puritanist, very narrow mindset via Protestantism. And this whittles away at a very staunchly Catholic tradition, because Protestantism isn't so pluralistic in its beliefs, so the Welsh poetry loses a lot of its motifs, and it becomes more and more insular in a way, and the quality is degrading. It's quite clear by the 1600s that the traditional praising of the lords is coming to an end, and that religious poetry in many senses is taking over, which is not as ornate nor boastful, and certainly the comedy is quite absent in this period. So as the Cynghanedd and the Cywydda are decreasing in the influence in the 17th century, we do get more free verse coming in. People like Hugh Morris using elements of Cynghanedd, but in a way that's more flirtatious, and we get a lot of more of the folk or peasant singing. We get influences beginning from traditional carols. As the gentry leaves the poetry, we get more of the underclass coming up and supporting the poetry, so that it was always there, we just didn't see it at the time. But there's also that paper is becoming more widespread. People were able to document these things. On the higher end of the spectrum, we have didactics. We have people like Morgan Llwyd, who are writing very staunchly religious-based poetry. The poetry is very monotonous in the 17th century for a lot of purposes, but we do get more new ideas from the New World. America is being discovered. We get things like poetry about tobacco, about dolphins in the Caribbean. We get glimpses of the expanding British Empire through the eyes of the Welsh, which brings new and fascinating things into Wales. You also get meters emerging like the Hen Benellion, which traditions would have been kept orally, and now they're being transmitted into paper. Short verses being transmitted for the first time. Dialects and regional variations really cropping up very strongly. By the end of the 17th century, you get people looking back towards the golden ages of the Welsh princes and David ap Gwilym and saying, well, how have we gone wrong? Why is our poetry not the grandeur that it was? And you get people, linguists like Edward Llwyd, who studied the connections between the various Celtic languages, and people are taking encyclopedic knowledge of these various Celtic cultures and coming back to Wales and trying to find manuscripts within libraries and find the old poetry, recover it before it's lost, and this leads to a resurgence in interest in the old poetry, which begins to eject a bit of new life during this period of extreme puritanical religious conservatism. Because of these antiquarians, you have people founding societies like the Cymrodorion in London and the Gwyddedigion, which are not only literary but patriotic. Their interests are in promoting Wales, in keeping the culture. On the one hand, you have these gentlemen, kind of say, these antiquarians. Among them are the Morrishaid of Mon, who are men of letters for every purpose, who write back and forth, and their correspondence can fill volumes, and we have that as well. But on the other hand, you have the folk tradition, which is still developing. It's affected very deeply by the rise of Methodism and kind of this oppressive religious culture via the chapels, which is very dominant. Although it's quite rigid and monotonous, the religious culture in Wales does produce some very beautiful poetry, like William Williams' Pantycelyn and hymns, and you get things of this nature. And here are a few of the people of this period. Goron Mwy Owen was quite unique. He wrote poetry in the New World, in Virginia. I personally, as an American, find his Welsh poetry quite unique. But going forward through the 18th century, people are attending schools, which helps push Welsh poetry up. People are more literate. And then something new happening. Twm o'r Nant, on one hand, and Iolo Morgannwg. Iolo Morgannwg changes Welsh poetry in such a profound way that I need to end this first video here and then have a second video during Iolo Morgannwg's time and since then, because he changes it in so many different ways that Welsh poetry is not the same from about 1800 on. If you like this video, please subscribe, please like.